Thank you very much, Philip and Jesko for the invitation, Nicole for the organization, and Kerstin for the wonderful exhibition on scenarios in the foyer, which you should definitely see. Actually, I'm continuing right from where we stopped, about utopia, but I will add the category of scenarios. This conference posed a question, and the question was, can design change society? Well, can designers change society? I would pose, and I would say, of course they can. The question is, how? And do they achieve what they intended to? Or do they change it in ways they never expected to? Utopia, as Morris introduced it, is a place far, far away. It is disconnected to the present, either in time or in space. As a literary genre, utopia is an experiment of the mind, as we have seen today. It's an experiment of how things could be different. The setup allows to imagine another, a very different world, not one that we want, and not one that we want to build. Utopia is not to be achieved, but to be thoroughly studied in order to learn about the here and now, in order to learn about the present. In architecture and urban design, the ideal city, as here, this wonderful example by Josef Rotenbacher the Jüngere, which looks like a duct section or like a microchip, but actually it's a city. The ideal city embodies a utopian thinking. An ideal city is a radical design. It shows the consequences of fundamental decisions. In most historic cases, these concerned optimal defense structure and optimal distribution function. By concentrating on only a very small selection of what a city is actually about, ideal cities are spatial thought experiments. The design of each ideal city shows what would follow from radical, elemental, and isolated decisions on urban form. So let's move to the modernity. Jaap Bakema, here with his colleague in his office, Joe van den Broek, main slogan was famously "From chair to the city." That was the dream of modern total design. His gigantic proposal for a city extension to the east of Amsterdam, the Pampus Plan, is a modern ideal city. It's a total design, it's radical in its reduction to a few core principles. Every inhabitant, every visitor has his or her place. It dates from 1965. Implementation of design is always limited by available resources. Architects of historic ideal cities knew that their designs would most likely never be implemented. Industrialization changed that. It increased our means and our resources in manifold. Society acquired unprecedented power to shape its environment. Bakema's Pampus Plan may be an ideal city, but it could have been built. The Netherlands actually are a very good place to study the question of whether design and designers can change society. The Dutch traditionally believe in what they call maakbaarheid. That's the Dutch word for makeability. It means that society can shape not only its own environment, but that society can shape itself. This belief in the power of design peaked with the confluence of the rise of the Dutch welfare state, the near total public control of housing production and housing market, and the great wealth generated by natural gas sold off since the 1950s, which was found in the northern provinces. So let's see where that led to. This is Siegfried Nassuth. Nassuth was an architect. He was trained in Delft. He was a student of Cornelis van Eesteren. In the Second World War, he had been imprisoned as a forced laborer for the Death Railway in Burma, which the Japanese built between Thailand and Burma, and he was very likely heavily traumatized. In Amsterdam, he joined the city planning department, and he rose to lead the team for the design of the great city extension to the southeast, which we today know as Bijlmermeer. Former team members recall his soft manners and his fits of rage when his radical design positions were challenged. due to a scandalous lack of political checks and balances and an equally scandalous arrangements between state and building industry, he was able to realize an ideal city in all of its narrowed-in radicality. Nasud's fixation was on egalitarianism. A team member remembered a discussion about floor plans. The Beimermeer apartments were often innovative and generous in their layout. For Nasud, they also had to be all the same. When his team members drew windows in the corner apartments, right here, for example, he became furious. Nobody was to get a better place than his neighbor. His design had to be total, and his ambition was social engineering. Beimermeer could only be built because the designers found themselves in an almost closed world beyond public control. The result was for many reasons a spectacular failure. One reason was Nasud's categorical position on vertical separation of traffic. An entirely flat polder, the construction of levees and bridges, was a huge misallocation of funds. Due to poor contracts, the builders scrapped most social infrastructures, and the ground floors were not left open for the undulating landscape to pass through, but used for storage, creating bland walls. However, these reasons were not the reasons for which Beimermeer was eventually known or despised by most architects. It was the decision to allocate 90% of its houses in high-rises. And this choice was something that the great urban designer Jacoba Mulder, who worked with Cornelis van Esteren on the great Amsterdam extension plan in the 1930s, had strongly criticized in the design process right from the start. But due to the mentioned lacks in checks and balances, this was never changed. Nasud and the building industry preferred it that way, and that is the way it was built. Here you see Dirk Vrieling. He studied also under Van Esteren at TU Delft, and he worked in his first job with Siegfried Nasud on the Beimermeer. He then very quickly left for the polders. The polders are the reclaimed land in the northeast of Amsterdam, the so-called Zuiderzee project, which was a huge land reclamation project going on for 50 years. His main task, he became deputy director of the administration, was to build the Markerwaard, that is this part here. It has never been built today. This is Almere, this is Amsterdam. He later also designed Almere, the biggest new town in the Netherlands, which is located here. And he collaborated very intimately together, worked together with Teun Koolhaas. The family name is familiar, the face usually not. It's the older cousin of Rem Koolhaas. He was a sort of architectural prodigy at TU Delft, and then he joined the state administration for the IJsselmeer polders and built the new land and designed Almere. He later also designed the Kop van Zout in Rotterdam. The construction of the Markerwaard, the new land, was the first reclamation project in the history of the Netherlands that was contested. Opponents, as you can see here, used simple but effective images of the future, which I call trend as threat scenarios. A trend scenario is usually used to show how bad things will go if nothing happens, or if things go as they are planned. Vrieling and Koolhaas were puzzled. To them, the inscription on the monument of the Afsluitdijk, the great Dutch barrier dam, that's that one, that was built in the 1930s, reads, "A nation that lives builds its future." That was law to them. And they could not understand that you would not do that, in the Netherlands especially. A few years later on, after they failed, they reflected of what was the reason, and they reflected, without the expectation that the future is for a part makeable and controllable, for which one has no other means than today's knowledge, any planning, and one could add design, is meaningless. If the aim of planning is the pursuit of a better quality of life for future generations, then one has to be optimistic about the possibilities to reach that goal. And they tried to change the mood about the Markerwaard by introducing a new methodology in planning and design, which is the scenario technique, which had come from military planning and state planning in France. And they designed 4 scenarios for the Marktwart, very different radical ones, as something just for agriculture, for industry, for recreation, to show you can do whatever you want with the new land as long as you build it. It will take 20 years to build, and then you can decide what you want. That was their reasoning. Well, the opponents were not very much impressed, and they said, we don't want it anyway, and it has never been built until today. They tried to do what the one of the founding fathers of modern advertisement, Edward Bernays, once called the engineering of consent, meaning they tried to manipulate the public opinion on their project, and they failed. It was never built. They were completely frustrated, of course. They'd worked their entire professional life on that project, with them a couple of hundred designers, engineers, and so forth. So they tried to change that mood in the country, which they thought was very bad for progress. The greatest villain to them was the limits to growth. They said it's sort of a sickness that has fallen upon this country, and it's embodied in this book, which shows that the future is not good. So what we have to do is to show you that the future can be good if you make it good. And they started a huge scenario exercise. It was an exhibition project, was a design project, was a 5-year project, was called The Netherlands Now as Design. These are 2 images of the Netherlands in 2050, a socialist Netherlands, a technocratic Netherlands. There was also a conservative Netherlands, and there was also a liberal Netherlands. They tried to change that mood. Almost nobody came to visit the exhibition. The mood didn't change. But about 300 designers learned how to use scenarios. So they changed the way of planning and designing in the Netherlands for good. The episode shows, besides the methodological innovation, that trend as threat scenarios are almost always more powerful than normative scenarios. That's a technical term for a desirable scenario. In their design for Almere, the new town, Vrieling and Koolhaas did something very different, actually. Here you can see the dike. You see that the land is lower than the water. It was just dried out. It took 2 years to pump the water out. The bridge was built. And this is the place where this new city would rise, which today has 200,000 inhabitants. In their design for Almere, Vrieling and Koolhaas were, just as Nassut, almost entirely independent. The new land of the city had not yet been reclaimed. There was no population, no neighbors, and hence no politicians. But their approach was entirely different than that of Nassut. In the original reclamation concepts for the Zuiderzee polders, there had been no plans at all for a city at the site of Almere. But Amsterdam's suburban belt grew faster than expected, driven by car ownership, increasing wealth, and the desire for what the Dutch call grondgebonden wonen, ground-bound living in a semi-detached house or a row house. The city of Lelystad, only 20 kilometers further north, had been intended to be the main city, but it failed to attract business and employment. Almere's fate was uncertain. Would it grow to become a city? Would it stagnate as a small housing cluster? Was there any chance for a university there? Vrieling and Koolhaas took this uncertainty as their starting point. Taking Milton Keynes in Great Britain as an example, they developed the 1 kilometer grid as a general framework for a polynuclear city that could evolve towards hugely different population numbers, from 50,000 to 250,000, and towards a multitude of functions. They tested possible developments in scenarios, which you can see here. There were many of them, that's just examples. But these scenarios were very different ones than the exercise for the Marktwart. They served not to engineer the public opinion. They were internal design tools to verify key decisions and structures. Vrieling and Koolhaas did not believe in from chair to the city. Their plan was to provide as much freedom as long as possible, and their ideal was to let inhabitants eventually choose how to live. Almere was built, and it grew much quicker than expected to 200,000 inhabitants within 35 years. But just as Lelystad without the business hoped for. It still continues to grow today. There are major extension plans ongoing or being constructed right now. Almere has been very successful to provide exactly the kind of housing typology sought after. Its pragmatic design accommodates for both uncertainty and for the flexibility of meeting market demands. The result is just as homogeneous as Bijlmermeer, but its inhabitants are regularly told to be much more content with their living environment than in most other cities. Just as in Bijlmermeer, the key decision for Almere's urban form was not a result of the design. It was a starting point. It was 90% ground-bound living. Teun Koolhaas, for his part, took the critique of the high-rise living further, and for the rest of his life he wanted to tear down all high-rise apartments in the Netherlands, which did mostly not happen. Despite the positive polls, Almere has drawn scorning criticism not from inhabitants, but from both architects and urban designers, and a lot from people not living there. The main argument is a lack of urban quality, a boring all the same urban form, and eventually also a lack of real freedom, since the housing was provided by publicly owned corporations in mediocre design to meet popular taste. The office of Teun Koolhaas' younger cousin, Rem, has designed two important projects that embody these arguments. The first is Homeros Quarter. It's a new neighborhood in the new nucleus Almere Port. Here, inhabitants can do something that is utterly banal and usual for future house owners in the whole world, except for in the Netherlands. They can build a house to their taste with an architect. That was something that was impossible in the Netherlands for about 100 years because everything was built and then you could buy it. Actually, you should buy it before it was built. That was better for the builder. The urban design is actually a literal framework of roads and parks for an unprecedented freedom of architecture. And that idea is not from Rem Koolhaas, it's from Karel Weber, also professor of TU Delft, who developed the concept of the wilde wonen, the wild living, about 20 years earlier. You see it here under construction. So this is taking the idea of freedom for Almere a step beyond. Rem Koolhaas is a dialectic thinker, and the second project reflects that. It's the heart of the city, the Stadshart. It's actually right the opposite. It's a super condensed insertion of urbanity, vertical mixture of functions, a condensation of public space and functions. It is a tiny ersatz metropolis for Almere, a carefully constructed situation in the sense of the situationist idea of manipulating the individual urban experience, like Guy Debord wanted. Only in this case, it's not about revolution, it's about shopping. So this is the small dialectic between different projects, and the French historian of the future, Georges Minois, summarized it once like that. We have a curious dialectic relation between utopia, its realization, and dystopia, whereby the first predicts a paradise that some attempt to realize. As soon as the dream takes shape, it appears as hell, calling on new prophets who herald the first project in a dystopia and warn against the dream turned nightmare. So is this the end, a to and fro of big plans and designs? Is utopia and scenarios finished in pragmatism? I don't think so, not least because this exercise in the Netherlands now as design really changed how the Dutch urban planners, designers, and architects work. So two examples are the first is from Adriaan Geuze. As a young student, he collaborated in the Netherlands now as design and learned the scenario method. You can see two of his projects in this wonderful exhibition that I mentioned out in the foyer. And that's one of his plans from 2006. It's the marker I. It's located between Almere and Waterland, and Amsterdam is towards here, to where I stand. It's an ideal city. It was not for construction. And it's actually a water machine that solves a range of hydraulic and infrastructural issues with the IJsselmeer and provides attractive living environment. It is a radical design, and it is an ideal city. But if you compare to what I've shown you before, there's something different. It's also a communicative device. The plan assembles well-known tropes. You can see here, of course, Venice, and you can see Florida's lagoons. You see the Manhattan Park and Grid, and you see bucolic family gardens. So it becomes a communicative device to restart a discussion. The second example is this person, that is Zef Hemel. He's a planner. He was the general secretary under Friedling and Koolhaas for the Netherlands now as design, and then he became deputy director of the city planning department in Amsterdam. He wanted to convince the neighboring municipalities that Amsterdam should be planned and thought across the municipal boundaries. To do so, he went one step further than scenarios. He went to what we call today narrative planning. What does it mean? His team did not design the possible future Amsterdam metropolis. They did that later, you see it in the exhibition, but the first step was they tried to plant the idea deep into the mind of the decision makers. Maybe you've seen the film Inception, where they plant an idea into someone's head. That's exactly the idea that they had. How did they do it? They didn't design a city. They designed 7 lectures with very beautiful plans and beautiful words and beautiful tropes. And they started to deliver that lecture over 2 years to everyone who wanted to hear it or who did not want to hear it, from the neighborhood committee to the politicians to the airport and probably to Henk Oosterling as well. And what they had in mind was nothing short of ending what we heard from Professor Snotzi, that idea, 100-year-old idea of the Randstad, Holland as a polynuclear city of equals. They want to replace it with the idea of Amsterdam as a metropolis of global position, which is connected to its hinterland, but is a clear dominant structure in the country. Hemel drew his conclusions of the Markerwaard failure. His approach is to design not ideal cities for the public opinion, but to design the public opinion itself, to design how people imagine their environment. In other words, it's not social engineering, as Nassau did. It's also not the engineering of consent, which Friedling and Koolhaas tried. It's what I would call the imagineering of consent, which is a term that I borrowed from Walt Disney. I think time will tell whether this will be successful or not. Today we can already discuss its legitimacy, which is a big question, and also the responsibilities of designer. What's our responsibility? What can we do? And what should we do? I'm at the end of my argument. Just to give you an overview of what I've shown you, I made a small postscript on scales. This was the planned campus. Here you see Amsterdam, the old city center. This is the IJsselmeer. This is Almere. This was the Bijlmermeer extension, which was actually built. This was the planning for Almere, which also was built. These are the 2 projects of Rem Koolhaas, the Stadshart and the Homerus Quarter, built and under construction. This is Adrian Geuze's marker I between Almere and Waterland. This was the planning for the Markerwaard polder, which would go until here. And this is the plan of Hemel for Amsterdam Metropolis, just to give you also some food for thought about scale and design. Thank you very much.